Paul Morphy takes big risks in this game against Jacob Lowenthal, which was played when Morphy was touring Europe. It was a match played against Lowenthal in London in 1858. Morphy has white in this game. He plays the king's gambit, and he takes big risks with his king, and Lowenthal was a strong player. And we see Morphy having to fight back in this game. Really quite a compelling matchup. Let's begin. Morphy again had white, so he played e4. Lowenthal had black. He responded with e5, and f4 we have our king's gambit, and Lowenthal plays bishop to c5. If you're not familiar with this move, it looks odd, but it's actually an effective way to decline the king's gambit, because if white takes on e5 with a pawn, then queen to h4 check leads to a decisive attack. So that's the trap there. Of course, Morphy knew that very well and played the standard knight to f3, d6, and c3. The idea is white's trying to build a big pawn center and play d4 and maybe gain a tempo against that bishop along the way. Black pins that knight, restraining that d4 move a bit, but bishop to c4 from Morphy. As we know, he liked to develop his pieces, so he's getting his pieces out. Lowenthal takes on f3, losing a tempo. You know, he didn't wait for Morphy to kick that bishop before he captured on f3. And now Morphy has a pretty good position. We see the queen and bishop potentially lining up against this f7 pawn, but knight to f6 is played. b4 from Morphy, gaining space with the tempo against the bishop. Bishop to b6 and d3. So Morphy's doing pretty well, but this bishop's quite irritating. You know, white cannot castle right now. He'd have to block with his own dark squared bishop in order to do that. Knight b to d7 from black, and now f5 from Morphy, not opening up the position, but locking it up. And the idea, of course, is that he can expand on the king side with g4, g5, and maybe even attack there. But black wants to counterattack in the center. We know the best way to deal with an attack on the side of the board is to counterattack in the center. So moves like c6 and d5 could be coming from black. Queen to e7, though preparing long castling. He does not want to castle on the king side with this g4, g5 advance coming. g4 is played. h6 to stop the advance to g5 for the moment. But we have to ask ourselves the question, what about Morphy's king? Where is that king going to find safety? And the truth is, there's really no comfortable place for it, not on the king side or the queen side. So Morphy decides to actually keep his king in the center of the board, a big risk. King to e2, clearing the back rank. He still has these two minor pieces on the queen side, but at least the rooks will be able to connect. The king is out of the way, but a king on e2 is obviously quite vulnerable. c6, Lowenthal begins that push in the middle of the board to open things up, counterattack in the center, and there's no two ways about it. Black has a good position here. Lowenthal is doing well. g5 from Morphy, pawn takes, bishop takes g5, and d5, that key central break, and Morphy does not want to take on d5 and open that up, so he retreats the bishop back to b3. Queen to d6. Now, he could have played d4. This was pretty strong, weakening this b4 square, but he probably didn't want to create a locked structure in the middle of the board. So instead, he plays the move queen to d6, getting out of the pin from the bishop at g5. Knight to d2, Morphy gets his last minor piece developed. Traditionally, Morphy would have a lead in development, but in this game, black has developed well. And now a5, a strong move, attacking b4 and preparing to activate his rook along the a file. The pawn is taken, and he takes with the rook. Here Morphy plays h4. That defends the bishop at g5. That also limits the scope of black's rook on h8. And now knight to h5. And Lowenthal continues to play very strong moves. This knight is aiming at this f4 square where it will deliver check. And if Morphy is forced to give up his dark squared bishop for the knight, then his dark squares become weak, and he can get in some big trouble. Knight to f1 from Morphy. Maybe he's trying to exchange knights on g3. Maybe he wants to move his knight to e3. Knight to c5 from Lowenthal, continuing his incredibly strong play. Hitting the bishop, threatening to take away the two-bishop advantage for white, but also putting pressure on d3, where the knight and queen might be able to meet and cause a lot of trouble later. So Morphy retreats the bishop to c2 and defends d3. Here, black had a really strong move, and that's the move rook to a3, directly attacking that pawn on c3. He doesn't want to advance the pawn and create further weaknesses, and the bishop comes back to d2 to defend, then knight to f4 check, overloading that bishop, and if he wants to take the knight, he would no longer be defending c3. So that was a strong move, but Lowenthal plays a good move. Also, he plays rook to b5, threatening to come into b2 and pin that bishop that's at c2. So bishop to c1 from Morphy to keep the rook out of b2. de4, Lowenthal continues to make very good moves, opening up lines against white's king. de4, and now this is where things begin to turn. Perhaps Lowenthal was himself inspired by Morphy, and now he tries to play like Morphy and gets himself in a little bit of trouble. The idea is very creative, however, and it's the idea he plays the move rook to b2. A better move was probably to just hop into f4 here. After bishop f4, ef4, knight d2, and rook b2, black is still maintaining a nice advantage. But here, this, of course, is a rook sacrifice. Bishop takes b2. So what is Lowenthal's idea? Well, this is what he was aiming for. Knight to f4 check, king to e1. Notice the queen covers the d file, and these two squares would be, there'd be a discovery along this file. So he pretty much is forced to go to e1. But now, knight f to d3 check, forking the king and the bishop. First, of course, Morphy does take that knight with his light-squared bishop, but then knight to d3 check, again hitting the king and the bishop, king to d2, and now knight to b2 check. It's a discovered check from the queen. So Lowenthal has given up an exchange, and he has well-placed pieces. He does have some potential for attack, but here's the problem. This rook at h8 is not involved. If this rook was active on the king side, then black might very well have a winning advantage after that sacrifice. But the fact that this rook is out of play means that he doesn't quite have enough to put Morphy's king out of commission. And it's shocking how quickly the game ends in Morphy's favor. King to c2, directly attacking the knight. Black should probably play knight to c4. White's still better with his material edge, but at least black is still playing. But he plays the move queen to a3, defending the knight and getting his queen closer to the white king. But after Morphy's next move, the game is essentially over, and it's very simple. Knight to d2. And the threat of knight to b1 means that black is in huge trouble. In the game, he played bishop to c7, and then knight to b1, directly attacking the queen and forcing it away from the defense of the knight. There's nowhere the queen can move where it stays defending the knight. b4 is controlled by the pawn, and so the queen would have to move. And in this position, Lowenthal resigned, knowing he was going to lose a minor piece and would be down a whole rook. But let's say he doesn't play bishop to c7. What if instead he played knight to a4 with the threat of the queen coming into b2? Morphy would still keep a clear advantage after rook h to b1, not only stopping the queen's invasion, but preparing knight to c4, hitting the queen and the bishop. Queen to c5, then rook to b4, hits the knight. Queen to a5, you see the queen is overloaded. Knight to c4 hits the queen and the bishop. Queen to a6, just barely trying to hang on. And then after a move like queen to g4, attacking the g7 pawn, king to f8, then rook to d1. And not only is he down material, but Morphy has a blistering attack, and he certainly would not be able to survive that position. So a unique game, really, in the Morphy catalog of games. Not one where he was under the attack, one where he was under pressure, but he found a way at the end to use his tactical brilliance to win against a strong opponent. Hope you've enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.